I'd like to begin today with a thought exercise. So I want you to all imagine that you are a young conservative citizen of Hungary. The Cold War has just ended, communism has fallen, and you want to restore your nation. But there are quite a few challenges to this that you face. Your country is allegedly post-communist, but the very same old communist officials and apparatchiks are still infesting all the positions of power. Only now they call themselves liberals. Every institution, including the administrative bureaucracy, the legal system, the media, the cultural centers, and the universities are still controlled by the post-communist left. Even the private corporations are owned by the left, since all the former state companies were sold off on the cheap to corrupt ex-communist officials. Meanwhile, the common people are atomized, distrustful, dispirited. For decades, the communist regime deliberately crushed all associations and organizing by non-communists. Now the only ones with any real organizational capacity are the former communists, who maintain an immense network. Under communism, there was a party organizer, an informant, stationed in every single apartment building across the country. And they're still there. They're all still there, ready to mobilize politically for the left, except now under democracy. In other words, I want you to imagine, and I know this will be very difficult, that your country is controlled by a vast, entrenched, and unaccountable leftist deep state. So how can you possibly take on this Leviathan and prevail against it in a democratic system? Well, the young right-wing Fidesz party of now Prime Minister Viktor Orban managed to do it. And they did it by completely changing the rules of the game through a strategy of parallel organizing. Rather than work within a rigged system, they maneuvered outside the former political structures and pivoted directly to the grassroots level. They deliberately turned away from high politics and founded what was called the civic circles movement. The civic circles were not even a political movement. They focused on establishing community organizations across the nation to bring people together in grassroots civic action, volunteer work, and practical education in local self-governance. So chapters of local volunteers planted gardens, collected trash, helped with childcare. That one was especially popular. They helped local people in need and helped solve local problems. They founded new parallel education and media systems and institutions. They provided forums for free intellectual discussion and debate. They promoted art and culture that happened to celebrate national history and conservative values. They formed chapters in the universities and provided a patronage network to help identify and launch promising young talent throughout society. In short, the Hungarian left deliberately copied the left's boundless energy for community organizing, and it worked brilliantly. When the moment came to challenge the left in the political sphere, the Hungarian right, formerly limited to a party of conservative intellectuals who sat around at conferences, was able to mobilize a robust, entirely new grassroots power base made up of the country's working and middle class, which it had built from the ground up. Suddenly, they had extensive grassroots organizational capacity. They had their own information networks. They had a nationwide network of young, energetic, and loyal elite talent that they could incorporate into the party. They had kickstarted many of the country's young cultural tastemakers. And most importantly, they had genuine popular legitimacy. They had earned this by actually improving people's everyday lives on the street. So with this combination of popular legitimacy and a networked elite vanguard, Fidesz was able to not only repeatedly win electoral landslides, but was able to systematically take over, staff, and run its own conservative deep state, transforming the media, the culture industries, the universities, and ultimately the whole country. Therefore, in a sense, the parallel community organizing and institution building of the civic circles movement was actually political movement from the start. It just wasn't politics as we've been reduced to viewing it here in the United States, as cycles of empty policy platforms, fundraising, and get out the vote efforts that repeat every few years while nothing really changes. In reality, and this is a very important lesson, for too many conservatives in the West have forgotten that that kind of thing isn't real politics at all. It's just a simulacrum. It's a game. Real politics is about power, and real power is generated by accumulating legitimacy. Legitimacy is about where people turn when they need protection and support in their lives. If the bulk of the people turn first to an organization outside the state and its institutions, whether because those state institutions are too incompetent or too actively hostile to help them, then that parallel organization has more legitimacy than the state. And once an organization has more legitimacy than the state, there's a real possibility that it may soon replace the state. Such is the way of nature and nature's laws. Which is why when Fidesz started the civic circles movement, the post-communist left attacked it immediately and ferociously, using every lawfare and propaganda tool they could bring to bear to do so. Being former revolutionaries, they knew exactly how powerful this strategy could be if it fell into the hands of the right. But in the end, they couldn't succeed with a decentralized organizational structure, a system of grassroots self-funding, and a nonpartisan, beneficial charitable mission. The civic circles proved too resilient for the state to smother. Now, I raise this example from Hungary because this is a panel about building parallel alternative structures. And we're about to hear, I'm sure, some great examples of how conservative leading folks around the world have been acting to build parallel institutions to meet their own communities' needs amid aggressively leftist cultural regimes, failing states, and conditions of anarcho-tyranny. But I don't want those listening today to miss the bigger picture, which is that parallel organizing and institution building is not just a means of coping. It's not a form of running away from the political battle. It is the political battle. The left has always understood this. This is the basis on which every revolutionary group builds power and overtakes the state. It is only in recent decades, after achieving hegemonic power, that the left has, across the West, become the party of smug, distant elites and sclerotic top-down bureaucracy, fundamentally alienated from the people. The parallel strategy now lies mostly forgotten, dropped in the gutter by the left. Whenever and wherever the right has picked it up and adapted it, however, whether by Fidesz in Hungary, the BJP in India, or elsewhere, it has proven to be by far the most consistently resilient and effective means for the right to take and maintain political power. And yes, I am suggesting that the USA is ripe for something similar. This is a country that is deeply atomized and degraded, with countless problems ignored or actively exacerbated by the Washington elite that are waiting to be addressed on the ground. Ours is a nation crying out for help. Anyone who could even begin to actually do something about these problems on the ground would quickly win themselves a crown. All that's needed on this front is some real leadership. So obviously the Republican Party will be never remotely capable of doing this, but perhaps some of you listening will be. Now, if you, being good conservatives, are disturbed at all by my allusions to the right learning from the lessons from the left, or even from revolutionaries, do be reassured that what I'm suggesting is only really an extension of the finest traditions of American conservatism. Consider this classic observation from Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. The common European, he said, is a passive and indifferent creature who, quote, thinks that everything is outside his concern and belongs to a powerful stranger called government. He enjoys what he has as a tenant, without any feeling of ownership or thought of possible improvement. This detachment from his own fate becomes so extreme that if his own safety or that of his children is threatened, instead of trying to ward off the danger, he folds his arms and waits for the entire nation to come to his rescue. In contrast, the American of the 19th century, Tocqueville said, quote, learns from birth that he must rely on himself to combat the ills and obstacles of life, calling upon authority only when he cannot do without it. Should an obstacle appear on the public highway and the passage of traffic is halted, neighbors, American neighbors, at once form a group to consider the matter, and from this improvised assembly, an executive authority appears to remedy the inconvenience before anyone has thought of the possibility of some other authority already in existence. The American people used to know instinctively how to organize. In fact, this used to be at the core of who we were. But sadly, it seems to me that the Americans of Tocqueville's day back then have largely today degenerated into his Europeans. So to embrace parallelism would be only to help remedy this terrible malady and help return us to our own traditional roots in the spirit of vital self-governance. Finally, I know many here today are feeling maybe a bit giddy about the upcoming elections. Why, you may be wondering, should we talk of building parallel institutions when another Trump administration feels like it may be just around the corner? Aren't we about to win? But again, I say unto you, ignore the real roots of political power at your own peril. Have you forgotten the lessons of Trump's first term? That absolutely nothing will change in Washington without the application of sufficient force and leverage to make it change. Have you forgotten the entrenched and unified managerial regime and its legions of bureaucrats, lawyers, so-called journalists, and paramilitary street thugs? By what means will you circumvent its power? How will you withstand its vicious counterattacks? And what happens if you lose again? What happens, for that matter, if the right is never allowed to win again? Better by far to invest in a long-term strategy that remains advantageous in every possible scenario. If you remain out of political power and beset by an increasingly frenzied and totalitarian leftist managerial regime, like our unfortunate friends across the pond, you will need parallel organizing to survive and resist. Let us remember that totalitarianism is essentially defined by the collapse of all intermediating institutions between the isolated individual and the state. Let us strive to rebuild those defenses. And even if swept into office, you will need to be able to organize and mobilize the masses to help push through major changes at every level, against the will of an anti-democratic elite and its managerial bureaucracy. Parallel organizing can help accomplish that and ensure lasting victory. And in any scenario where political power and control, God forbid, is divided and contested, the side with the better on-the-ground organizing will prevail. Finally, let us remember that the American people, on both sides of the political divide, are truly suffering. Beyond politics, they could really use some help. So for that matter, could all of Western civilization. And I say building parallel institutions outside of our failing regimes is the way to do so. This is a time of both crisis and great opportunity for conservatives. I hope that they can choose wisely and begin building a parallel path to political power. Thank you.